He was weak. That is what Scott Steiner said about Ric Flair in 2024. Not 20 years ago, not during the Monday Night Wars, right now. In a recent interview, Steiner made it very clear he has not softened with age. When asked about Flair returning to the ring as an old man, Steiner did not wish him well. He said Flair was not an old friend of his. He said he would kill him in the ring. He said he would destroy him. Then he said something even more brutal. People do not want to see Ric Flair wrestle anymore. They just want to see him get beat up. If you like this kind of no-filter wrestling history, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. This is Scott Steiner in 2024. Still angry, still holding grudges from decades ago, still unable to let anything go. And that tells you everything you need to know about the genetic freak. He has spent his entire career building a mental list of the weakest people in wrestling. Not weak in the sense of being small, weak in the sense of being fake. Politicians who used backstage power instead of talent. Frauds who fooled the fans. Soft, modern wrestlers who would never have survived in the old days. Steiner has names for all of them, and he has never stopped attacking them. This video walks through 10 examples of people Steiner targeted as weak. 10 wrestlers who reveal what Steiner really hates about the wrestling business. And by the end, you will see that his weak list says more about him than it does about anyone else. Scott Steiner did not start out as a bitter shoot promo machine. He began as a legitimate athlete, an NCAA All-American wrestler at the University of Michigan. That is a real accomplishment, not a storyline, not something bookers gave him. He earned it through actual competition. When he teamed with his brother Rick to form the Steiner brothers in the late 1980s, they were respected for their technical skill and raw power. They could do moves other tag teams could not even attempt. Frankensteiners off the top rope, belly-to-belly suplexes that launched opponents across the ring. They had legitimate credentials in an industry full of characters and gimmicks. But something changed in the late 1990s. Scott transformed into Big Papa Pump, the chainmail headpiece, the bleached goatee, the muscles that looked ready to explode. And with that physical transformation came a new approach to interviews. He started doing shoot-style promos. He stopped pretending everything was scripted fun. He began airing real grievances on live television, calling people out by their real names, accusing them of things that were meant to stay behind closed doors. Once he started shooting, he never stopped. This became his trademark, but it was also his downfall, because while being real made him compelling, it also made him dangerous, unpredictable, someone the industry could not trust. And that is the tragedy of Scott Steiner. He had the credentials to be a respected main eventer, but his obsession with exposing weakness turned him into a liability. His bitterness became the story instead of his talent, and that bitterness still burns today. Now let's walk through the 10 targets Steiner painted as the weakest in wrestling. These are presented in descending order, starting with number 10 and working down to number 1. Each example shows a different aspect of what Steiner considers weakness. Together they reveal his entire worldview. Number 10 is Ric Flair. This is the grudge that defines Scott Steiner more than any other. It started at Clash of the Champions 14 in January 1991. Steiner was an emerging singles competitor. Flair was the WCW World Heavyweight Champion. Their match was supposed to be a career-making moment for Steiner, a chance to prove he belonged at the main event level. The bout went to a 25-minute time limit draw. In most cases, that result elevates both wrestlers. But Steiner walked away furious. He believed Flair had sandbagged him. That means Flair deliberately worked slowly and poorly to make Steiner look bad, to sabotage the match so Steiner would not appear to be a legitimate threat. Why would Flair do this? According to Steiner, because Flair was scared. Scared that a younger, stronger, more legitimate athlete might replace him. And Flair had the power to prevent that. He was not just a wrestler. He was also on the booking committee. He could influence who got pushed and who got buried. Steiner argued that Flair used this dual role to cut the legs out from under rising stars. Other wrestlers noticed it too. Sting experienced it. Lex Luger experienced it. Flair would use his backstage influence to protect his position at the top. For Steiner, this was the ultimate form of weakness, using political power instead of proving yourself in the ring. The grudge festered for nearly a decade. Then it exploded on February 7, 2000. On Monday Nitro in Tulsa, Steiner went completely off script. He was meant to cut a standard wrestling promo. Instead, he delivered one of the most vicious shoot promos in history. He called Flair a fraud. He said Flair had stolen the Nature Boy nickname from Buddy Rogers. He mocked Flair's aging body. He talked about his loose skin, his crooked yellow teeth, He called him a jealous old man clinging to a spot he no longer deserved. The promo was so brutal that WCW suspended Steiner, but Steiner did not care. He had finally said what he had been holding in for years. The problem is, he never moved on. Most wrestlers eventually let old grudges fade. They make peace for the sake of business, but not Steiner. Jump forward to 2024. Flair is in his 70s. He has survived multiple health scares. He nearly died more than once, and he is still trying to wrestle. Most people see this and feel concerned or nostalgic, not Steiner. He sees an old fraud still pretending to be something he never was, and he wants to destroy him. That is a 30-year grudge. It reveals that Steiner cannot let anything go. His hatred for Flair has outlasted careers, companies, and entire eras of wrestling, and it has defined him more than any championship he ever won. Number 9 is Hulk Hogan. If Flair represented the old-school political establishment, Hogan represented everything fake about sports entertainment. Steiner's perspective on Hogan was heavily influenced by Randy Savage. Macho Man was close friends with Steiner, and he filled Steiner's head with stories about Hogan's backstage manipulation, how Hogan used creative control clauses in his contracts to bury other talent, how he politicked to make sure nobody ever got bigger than him, how he controlled booking decisions to protect his spot. Steiner listened to all these stories, and he came to believe Hogan was the biggest fraud in wrestling history, a man who built a legacy on lies, who fooled millions of fans into thinking he was a hero. But behind the scenes, Hogan was selfish and manipulative. Steiner also accused Hogan of racist behavior and using lawyers instead of settling disputes like a man. According to Steiner, Hogan would never engage in a real, physical confrontation. He would threaten legal action instead, file police reports instead of fighting. And to Steiner, that was pure cowardice. The hatred reached its peak during their time in TNA wrestling. Hogan and Eric Bischoff arrived in TNA in 2010, and according to Steiner, they immediately started repeating the same patterns that destroyed WCW, putting themselves in the spotlight instead of building new stars, making decisions based on ego instead of what was good for the company, prioritizing their friends over talented wrestlers. Steiner watched this happen and went on a Twitter rampage. He called Hogan a complete fraud who had fooled the world. He said Hogan destroyed WCW and was now destroying TNA. He accused Hogan of the same political games that ruined an entire company, and he refused to stay silent about it. This led to serious consequences. In 2015, WWE held a Hall of Fame ceremony for the NWO. Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Sean Waltman were inducted. Scott Hall was honored, but Scott Steiner was banned from attending. WWE did not trust him. They knew he might cause a scene. They knew he could not be controlled, so they excluded him entirely. And Steiner saw this as more proof. Proof that Hogan still had power. Proof that speaking the truth would always get you punished. Proof that weak men controlled the wrestling business. Number 8 is Eric Bischoff. If Hogan was the face of the problem, Bischoff was the suit making it all happen. Steiner called Bischoff a weasel, a corporate politician who cared more about personal loyalty than actual talent. Bischoff ran WCW during the Monday Night Wars. And while WCW had success for a few years, it ultimately collapsed. Steiner blames Bischoff for that collapse. He argues that Bischoff created a culture where backstage maneuvering mattered more than in-ring ability, where being friends with the boss was more important than being a good wrestler, where Hogan and his crew got everything they wanted while real athletes got held down. When WCW died in 2001, Steiner thought that would be the end of Bischoff's influence. But then Bischoff showed up in TNA, and he brought Hogan with him, and they started doing exactly the same things that killed WCW, putting themselves on television, pushing their friends, ignoring homegrown talent that fans actually cared about. Steiner was furious. He had watched this playbook destroy one company. Now it was happening again. After leaving TNA in 2012, Steiner unleashed on social media. He called out Bischoff by name. He accused him of being incompetent, of repeating the same mistakes because he had learned nothing from WCW's failure. And to Steiner, that incompetence was a form of weakness. Not physical weakness, moral weakness. An inability to learn or grow. An ego too big to admit mistakes. Bischoff represented everything Steiner hated about wrestling management. People in power who had never been real athletes, who did not understand or respect the wrestling business, who made decisions based on politics instead of merit. Number 7 is Garrett Bischoff. This target represents pure nepotism. Garrett is Eric Bischoff's son, and in TNA, he was pushed as a wrestler despite having no business being on television. He was not good. He was not ready. He did not have the skills or experience to justify his position, but he got a spot anyway. Why? Because his father had power. That is the textbook definition of nepotism, and for Steiner, it symbolized everything wrong with modern wrestling. Steiner called Garrett a nobody, a clown, someone who had not earned anything. He saw Garrett's push as an insult to every veteran who had spent years paying dues, every wrestler who had worked through injuries and traveled endless miles to earn a chance. And here was this kid, handed opportunities purely because of his last name. Steiner's hatred of Garrett was not really personal, it was ideological. Garrett became a symbol of a broken system that rewarded the wrong things, that valued family connections over talent, that let weak people succeed while strong people got held back. Every time Steiner saw Garrett on TNA television, it reminded him why he despised the business. It proved that hard work did not matter, that being legitimate did not matter, that the only thing that mattered was who you knew, and that infuriated him. Number 6 is Triple H. The 2003 WWE run is the chapter of Steiner's career that people remember as a failure. Steiner returned to WWE in late 2002 as a major signing. He was Big Papa Pump, the genetic freak, the man with the largest arms in the world. Fans were excited. This was supposed to be huge, but it did not work. The matches were slow and clumsy. The crowds lost interest. By the time Steiner left in 2004, most people considered the run a disaster. But Steiner does not blame himself. He blames Triple H, and there might be some truth to his version. When Steiner arrived in WWE, he was dealing with a serious medical condition, drop foot syndrome. It is a nerve problem that partially paralyzed his foot. He had to wear a rigid brace just to walk properly. He needed constant physical therapy. He had 9 screws surgically implanted in his foot to keep it functional. This was not a minor issue. It severely limited his mobility. It affected everything he could do in the ring. According to Steiner, Triple H knew about this condition, and instead of working around it, Triple H used it against him. Triple H was the world heavyweight champion at the time. He also had significant backstage influence. He could shape how storylines were presented, and Steiner claims that Triple H designed segments specifically to expose his weakness. Arm wrestling contests, bodybuilding pose downs, feats of strength competitions. These were not wrestling matches. They were exhibitions meant to highlight that Steiner could not move like he used to. Steiner called Triple H weak for this, not because Triple H lacked muscles, but because he was insecure, scared of facing a legitimate athlete on even terms. Steiner argued that Triple H only felt comfortable when protected by the Evolution faction, when he had Ric Flair, Batista, and Randy Orton backing him up. Without that protection, Triple H was exposed as someone who used political power instead of talent. Steiner even challenged Triple H to a steroid test. He said he would take a drug test if Triple H did the same. It was a bold move, a way to prove who was natural and who was not. But according to Steiner, WWE shut it down immediately. They refused to test either man, and Steiner interpreted that as an admission. Triple H was scared of the truth. He gave Triple H nicknames, Dipple H, the game with no balls, and he was not joking. To Steiner, Triple H embodied everything wrong with WWE corporate culture. A guy who built his career by marrying the boss's daughter, who used backstage relationships to protect his position, who buried talent to make himself look better. The irony is that Steiner's anger became the entire story, not the matches, not the championship program, just endless bitterness. And that bitterness ensured WWE would never bring him back. Number 5 is Diamond Dallas Page. This feud turned violent, and it ended in lawsuits. It started with an accusation involving Page's wife, Kimberly. In 2001, Steiner believed that Kimberly had informed WCW management about drug paraphernalia found in the women's locker room. This led to the firing of Tammy Sitch, who was associated with Steiner. Steiner viewed Kimberly's actions as stooging. In wrestling culture, you do not go to management with locker room issues. You handle things internally, but Kimberly broke that code, and Steiner could not forgive it. He responded by cutting a vicious shoot promo on live television. He verbally destroyed the Page family. He accused them of wife-swapping with the Bischoffs, and he used a vile insult to describe Kimberly on air, the kind of language that would never be allowed today. But this was WCW in its dying days. Standards had collapsed. The verbal assault led to physical confrontations backstage. DDP confronted Steiner, and Steiner completely dominated him. Reports say Steiner almost took DDP's eye out during their fight. Later that same night, DDP tried to confront Steiner again near the entrance area, and again Steiner overpowered him easily. Steiner's amateur wrestling background gave him a massive advantage in real fights. DDP simply could not match his strength or technique. This infuriated Page even more. The situation escalated when Kimberly Page filed a lawsuit. She claimed Steiner had created an unsafe work environment. She argued that his behavior made her fear for her physical safety, and she demanded compensation. Steiner viewed this as the ultimate act of cowardice, using lawyers instead of handling conflicts face-to-face. To him, it proved that DDP and Kimberly were fundamentally weak. They could not fight their own battles. They had to hide behind the legal system. While DDP eventually moved on from this incident, reconciled with the industry, and was inducted into the Hall of Fame, Steiner never gave him any credit. He consistently downplayed all of DDP's accomplishments. He claimed DDP's success was based on political positioning, that DDP used his wife to manipulate management, that everything DDP achieved was through scheming rather than talent. And in Steiner's worldview, that made DDP one of the weakest men in wrestling history. Number 4 is Samoa Joe. By the time Steiner reached TNA and the main event Mafia era, his targets had shifted. He was no longer just attacking older veterans. He started going after the next generation, and Samoa Joe became his primary target. The build to their Sacrifice 2008 match produced the legendary Steiner Math promo. The promo has become famous for being absolutely absurd. Steiner starts by claiming Kurt Angle knows he cannot beat him, so Angle is not even going to try. Then he adds Samoa Joe into the mathematical equation, and the numbers spiral into madness. Steiner calculates that Joe has an 8 1/3% chance of beating him. The logic makes no sense, but Steiner delivers it with complete conviction, like he genuinely believes his genetic superiority can be measured mathematically. The promo is funny. It has been memed endlessly online, but underneath the comedy is something much darker. Steiner's critique of Joe was rooted in appearance and genetics. He called Joe fat. He mocked his physique. He used the term half-breed to suggest Joe lacked genetic purity. It was cruel and nasty, and it revealed Steiner's obsession with physical superiority as the only measure of worth. Beyond the specific insults, Joe represented something Steiner despised: the modern generation of wrestlers. According to Steiner, this generation was soft. They played video games during their downtime instead of training. They read wrestling newsletters instead of living the business. They checked wrestling websites for star ratings instead of focusing on being tough. Steiner saw all of this as weakness, a betrayal of what wrestling used to be. In his mind, wrestlers should be hard men from amateur backgrounds or rough neighborhoods. They should not care about being liked by fans. They should care about being feared. But Joe and his generation were different. They grew up as wrestling fans. They were trained in wrestling schools. They cared about match quality and storytelling. And Steiner viewed all of that as fundamentally weak. Joe was popular despite not meeting Steiner's standards for what a wrestler should look like or act like. And that drove Steiner crazy. The feud was entertaining television, but it also showed how toxic Steiner's worldview had become. He could not accept that wrestling had evolved. He could not accept that different types of wrestlers could succeed, and so he attacked anyone who represented that change. Number 3 is Bruce Pritchard. This target is simpler than the others. Steiner accused Pritchard of being an incompetent stooge for management. Pritchard worked behind the scenes in WWE for many years. He was a producer, a member of the creative team, a company loyalist, and that is precisely what Steiner hated about him. Pritchard was not a wrestler. He had never competed in the ring. He had never put his body through the punishment that in-ring performers endure. Yet he had power over those who did. He could influence which storylines got approved. He could affect who got pushed and who got buried, and to Steiner that was completely wrong. Steiner did not have a deep personal feud with Pritchard like he did with Flair or Hogan, but Pritchard represented a type of person Steiner despised: the corporate bureaucrat, the guy who cared more about pleasing the boss than doing what was right for the wrestlers or the fans. Someone who had never earned respect in the ring, but wielded power from behind a desk. In Steiner's binary worldview, this made Pritchard weak. Not physically weak necessarily, but professionally and morally weak. Pritchard was part of the system that held real athletes back, part of the corporate structure that valued politics over talent. And that was enough for Steiner to put him on the list of weak people ruining wrestling. Number 2 is the booking committee and backstage politicians. This is not a single person, it is an entire category. The people who controlled wrestling through corporate power instead of athletic ability. This theme runs through almost all of Steiner's grievances. He fundamentally hated the idea that wrestling was controlled by people who manipulated power structures. Ric Flair is the perfect example, a wrestler who also sat on the booking committee, who could literally decide his own matches, who could protect his championship reign by preventing others from looking strong. Steiner believed wrestling should be a meritocracy. The toughest, strongest, most legitimate athletes should naturally rise to the top. But instead, the industry was controlled by politicians, by people who knew how to play backstage games, by people who were skilled at flattering bookers and making the right friends. And that reality infuriated him. Steiner saw himself as a victim of this political system. He had legitimate NCAA credentials. He had genuine physical ability. He had intensity and charisma. But he never quite reached the absolute top of the industry. Why? According to Steiner, because he refused to play political games. He refused to kiss up to bookers. He refused to politic for his position. He just wanted to be judged on his athletic merit. And in wrestling, that is not how things work. So they kept him from reaching his full potential. At least that is how Steiner interpreted his career. And that interpretation fueled his anger for decades. Every time he saw someone he considered weak holding a world championship, he blamed the politicians. Every time he saw someone he respected getting buried in mid-card feuds, he blamed the politicians. The booking committee was not just a group of specific people, it was a symbol, a representation of everything Steiner hated about how the wrestling business actually operated behind the curtain. Number 1 is the video game generation. This is Steiner's ultimate enemy, not a specific wrestler, but an entire culture shift in the wrestling industry. Steiner became famous for shaming younger wrestlers about their habits. He mocked them for playing video games during downtime. He ridiculed them for reading the Wrestling Observer newsletter. He attacked them for checking wrestling websites and caring about star ratings from internet critics. To Steiner, these behaviors represented the death of real wrestling. In his era, wrestlers were hard men. They came from amateur wrestling programs, from military backgrounds, from tough neighborhoods where they learned to fight. They did not care about being popular with fans. They cared about being genuinely feared and respected. But the modern generation was completely different. They grew up as wrestling fans. They were trained in professional wrestling schools instead of learning on the road from veterans. They cared about work rate and match psychology. They wanted to have great matches that critics would praise. They studied Japanese wrestling tapes. They talked about storytelling and character development. And Steiner saw all of this as weakness, softness, a betrayal of what wrestling was supposed to be. He believed the modern locker room had become soft, that wrestlers today would never survive in the rough environment of the 1980s, that they lacked the discipline and real toughness required to be legitimate, and he was not quiet about his opinions. Steiner's critique of the video game generation was not just nostalgia for the old days, it was about identity. He defined his entire self-worth through being hard, through his NCAA background, through his refusal to be soft in any way. And when he looked at modern wrestlers, he did not see that same hardness. He saw people treating wrestling like performance art instead of combat. He saw entertainers instead of fighters. And that disgusted him on a fundamental level. This critique reveals the core of Steiner's entire philosophy. To him, weakness was not primarily about physical size or strength. It was about attitude, about priorities, about whether you approached wrestling as a legitimate athletic competition or as scripted entertainment. Anyone who fell on the entertainment side was fundamentally weak in his eyes, and he had no respect for them whatsoever. But Steiner did not hate everyone in wrestling. He maintained maintained a short list of people he genuinely respected, hard men who met his impossibly high standards. Haku, also known as Meng, was at the very top. Steiner called him the single most feared man in wrestling history. Why did Haku earn that respect? Because he had a reputation for real toughness that was based on actual incidents. Stories of him biting off someone's nose in a bar fight, tales of him knocking out multiple attackers at once, being the one person in any locker room that absolutely nobody wanted to fight. That reputation was not built on scripted television angles. It was based on reality, and Steiner respected that immensely. The Barbarian also made Steiner's respect list. He was admired for his legitimate physical power and documented toughness. The Samoans as a group were on the list too, noted for their cultural background and physical hardness that made them naturally intimidating. And Scott Norton earned Steiner's respect as well. Norton was a champion arm wrestler, a genuine powerhouse with legitimate strength credentials outside of wrestling. What did all these men have in common? They did not need to engage in political maneuvering. They did not need to manipulate bookers or kiss up to management. Their reputations were built on being genuinely dangerous people. They were feared and respected because they were legitimately tough in real life, not because of scripted storylines. And Steiner valued that authenticity above everything else. But here is the fundamental problem with Steiner's worldview. It is completely binary. You are either hard or soft, either a real athlete or a politician, either legitimate or fake. There is no middle ground in his thinking, no room for nuance or complexity, no acceptance that wrestling can successfully be both athletic competition and theatrical performance at the same time. And that rigidity is what ultimately made Steiner his own worst enemy. Because while he was busy attacking everyone who failed to meet his standards, the wrestling business evolved and moved forward without him. So what does Scott Steiner's list of the weakest wrestlers actually reveal? It tells us far more about Steiner himself than about the people he attacked over the years. Steiner's definition of weakness was really a mirror reflecting his own deep insecurities. He could never let go of that 1991 match with Ric Flair, could never move past the perceived betrayal. He could not accept that the wrestling industry had changed and evolved, could not forgive anyone who achieved success using methods he personally despised. And so he remained angry for 3 full decades. His version of truth came with massive collateral damage. He systematically burned bridges with almost everyone in the industry. He made himself essentially unemployable by any major wrestling company. He got banned from Hall of Fame ceremonies. He became known more for his endless bitterness than for his legitimate accomplishments in the ring. And that outcome is genuinely tragic, because Scott Steiner was a real athlete with serious credentials. He had genuine NCAA achievements that most wrestlers could never claim. He was part of one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. He had all the physical tools necessary to be a major star at the highest level. But his complete inability to let grudges go destroyed his own legacy. His list of weak wrestlers became his entire identity, and instead of being remembered primarily as the genetic freak who dominated WCW, he is remembered as the bitter guy who never stopped shooting on everyone, the guy who could not move on. But even acknowledging all of that, there is something important to recognize. Even though Steiner's worldview is extreme and often self-destructive, even though his anger frequently turns him into his own worst enemy, he remains absolutely unforgettable. His promos are legendary pieces of wrestling history. His intensity was genuinely unmatched. His complete refusal to follow the rules or play politics makes him compelling in ways that carefully managed corporate wrestlers can never achieve. When Scott Steiner speaks, people stop and listen, not because everyone agrees with his perspective, but because he is raw and unfiltered, genuinely dangerous and unpredictable. You never know what he might say next. And in an era where absolutely everything is carefully scripted and sanitized by corporate PR departments, that unpredictability has real value. Steiner represents something professional wrestling has largely lost: a connection to when the business felt real and dangerous, when wrestlers supposedly settled genuine grudges with physical confrontations instead of lawyers, when being legitimately tough mattered more than social media follower counts. He is a relic from a completely different era, and even when you fundamentally disagree with his perspective, even when his bitterness becomes overwhelming and exhausting, you cannot look away from him, because whether you love him or hate him, Scott Steiner is undeniably real. style. And in professional wrestling, genuine authenticity is incredibly rare. That is exactly why people still discuss him constantly. Why his old promos still get shared and quoted online. Why even now in 2024, when he says he would destroy Ric Flair in the ring, people immediately pay attention. He is the genetic freak. He is not normal. And that fundamental abnormality is precisely why we remember him.